Well, I am pleased to thank the California Social Welfare Archives for their foresight in deciding to record visually a conversation with John Milner, who was a member of the faculty at USC from the mid-1940s until the mid-1970s. It's my pleasure to introduce present social workers and future social workers to a social work educator whose career was one of the most notable in the history of the profession. And it's my pleasure to have known him as a teacher, as a colleague, but mostly a very dear friend. Now, John, to begin with, I'd like to ask if you could tell me.
But first, June, I want to tell you something. I had a birthday 2 weeks ago, and I'm 97 years old.
And that's
And outside of the 22 years of growing up, I've been a social worker ever since. So that makes me a pioneer for sure.
For sure. But a distinguished one.
Yeah.
Pioneer, but one whose career, I think, has caught the attention of people in Los Angeles, in California, across the nation, and in many places of the world.
Oh, thank you.
So it is tremendous foresight of the archives to have made arrangements to preserve your perspective from the past and from the future for present and future social workers to see, to hear, and I hope to consider very seriously. It struck me as I thought about this interview that when you were a young man, early 20th century, needing to make choices of careers, social work was also very young. It was a young profession. I think people seeing this tape now and in the future would be really interested to know what attracted you to the field and how you progressed into your career.
Well, when I graduated from Stanford in 1934, this country was in its worst depression. Something began very much like we have today.
Yes, indeed.
And thousands and thousands of people in the United States and all parts of the world were out of work. Mm-hmm. And graduates had little choice, or if any choice, of jobs. Many of my friends didn't get jobs for years after. Mm-hmm. And I left the school and came home to my family home in Twin Falls, Idaho, which is a small town of about 30,000 at the time, and was mowing my lawn, or the family lawn, one day, mm-hmm. and a very attractive woman came out of a neighbor's house next door, and I asked my mother who this was, and she said she's a social worker from Cleveland, and the state has brought her in to establish programs in this part of the state, along with 2 or 3 other people they've brought in from other states. And I really didn't know what a social worker was, and didn't care much at the moment because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in a day or two, she came over, and this lady came over and introduced herself to me, and talked a while, and then a day or two later, after having seen her again, she said, why don't you come down and volunteer and see whether you like social work? And she said, there are opportunities in this. And you haven't anything to do except mow the lawn now. So I agreed to go down. And my life almost changed that day. I had never been with a very poor, hungry, desperate families situation and didn't know they'd even lived in our town or in the countryside as farm country around. And I started to learn how to interview and to get them registered so that they could take advantage of the different programs that were being developed. And for a month I stayed, and they offered me a salary of $17.50 a month. Not a day, not a week, a month. And I took it. And after the month was over, I had a letter from the state director saying, we'd like to have you go to another county and become the director of county public assistance. I was 21 and experienced, and agreed, and my salary would be raised to $25 a week. So I took off within a few days for a new adventure in Salmon City, Idaho. Beautiful little town that had been a mining town, high in the mountains of Idaho, beautiful section on the Salmon River. When I arrived, finally, in an old car I had to buy for about $200, it took me through bad roads and inconvenient places. I arrived, I had to register in the hotel. But in the instructions to me was that you have to find yourself a place to live. There were only 2 places in town where you could. They were private homes with people taking in roomers because of the Depression. They could make money. And then to find office space and to hire a staff. And I registered at the hotel, a little 3-story brick hotel. And when I got in the room, I saw a coil of rope at the bottom of the window. And I went over and felt it, and finally asked the next day, why is that rope in my room? And he said, if there's a fire, you just open your window and climb down the rope. And this pretty much typified the type of community at that time. But very shortly I was given help in finding a wonderful place to stay. But then I had to find an office space. And they wrote down a number of possible places where I could go to rent offices for the program. And I started off going to them, and I found out that every one of them were houses of prostitution, that this was a game on the part of the people I was meeting to break me into their city. And fortunately, I had a sense of humor and got better news as to where to go. But I did rent a space over a saloon. And this was a prohibition at this time, but it's kind of the breaking time prohibition. On Saturday night, they didn't obey the probation laws in that little city. But that was the first beginnings of where I could be. And I found on the second day I was there that a group of angry mining men were on the way from a town called Gibbonsville, 3 miles away, angry to the fact that no one had been serving their needs of their families, that they were living in deserted old log houses, and this had no food and had their families there. And altogether, I think there were about 12 families. And they drove up before the courthouse where I was temporarily holding out, and their car or big truck was loaded with rocks, ready to rock the offices. And you knew that all through California then, and all through Idaho and all the states that I work in, that there's this kind of rebellion of we have to have food. And I saw really hungry people and agreed to be down to their village within a few hours and arranged for them to have commodities which the government provided them: food, clothing, and some furnishings. And one of the major jobs of the social worker in the county was to get these things delivered to the people individually. Many had no communications, like a car or something to go. And so you'd see the social workers in this county and other counties maybe carrying an outhouse on top of their car to someone who needed it, a government gift, or seeing mattresses or something that came from the government, and seeing that their basic needs were met. And all through this, you realize that the most important thing that social workers do was to keep people fed and to keep them housed, and other things come next.
Well, from that beginning, can you trace this remarkable career of yours? After your initial experience, what were the things that attracted you to continue in the field?
I think the basic recognized that the needs of people were so great that some ways I felt I could help. And I think it's helped me start to do the most basic thing in social work do, is to start to understand yourself. And you move from being an adolescent to being a mature person.
Well, from that beginning, what would you say was the series of positions that you held in social work that led you to this remarkable and honored career? What were the steps from the Idaho beginning?
Well, I still in Idaho, and they made me a proposition of going to several parts of the state and helping to set up new kinds of programs that were being developed by President Roosevelt with the help of Hopkins, who is social worker officially and who lived in the White House at the time. And so I was sent to different parts of Idaho to do this. And probably the most dramatic one was the center in Sandpoint, Idaho, on the lake up there, that was a federal trenchant program in which the government had set these up in every state in the Union. And they would give food to the people who are on the move. People who've lost their jobs started wandering the country looking for some jobs someplace else. And they would come in on freight cars, and sometimes through the mountains in the winter would ride in the freight cars or in the coal cars in large groups at times. And some were frozen even coming into the city of Sandpoint, that they were tragic people, and they were not just poor. They were many educated people who at one time had been well-to-do and had lost all their money in the Great Depression. And Wall Street had not done them well. And our job was to give them breakfast and lunch and dinner and overnight. And from then they would move on. And but we interviewed them, so we'd keep a record of who they were, where they were, and so forth. So we constantly had letters coming, can you find our father, can you find our mother, can you help us locate? The families then started being split up and divided out of the tragedy of having inadequate money to be together again. And that was one of the saddest kinds of jobs that I had.
And the Depression kind of backed into World War II. And you had certainly a next step in this illustrious career during World War II. I suspect people would like to hear of that and how that then propelled you into social work education, into child welfare and social work education.
Yes, I spent 4 years in the Army. I was drafted at age 29, and as I went through the original registration, a young sergeant interviewed me briefly in a very untrained way. And then I was asked, what do you do for a living? I told him I was a social worker. By this time I'd gone to school. And I was a psychiatric social worker. And he turned around and in the rude Army language says, for Christ's sake, we've even got one of them. So I knew the reputation of social workers was not very accepting at that time. And interestingly, social workers never recognized in the military officially until after World War II. But those other times we eventually got assigned as psychologists.
Okay.
And so I eventually became a psychologist. But for a while, I was assigned to the motor pool. I didn't know a spark plug from something else. And my inadequacy in that, they transferred me to the business side of it, of keeping financial records and so forth, and sent me off overseas finally to a replacement depot in New Caledonia, on the island New Caledonia. And our responsibility there was to get ready to go into battle. And there were probably approximately 40,000 soldiers in the camp where I was. And every day there would be large numbers of them taken off to be sent to other parts of the world to fight. And my name was on the fight list. But fortunately for me, and I think this is just as incidental, a clinical psychologist from Chicago saw my name on the list, and he asked for me to be taken off and loaned to him. He would be allowed to keep me for a certain period of time, but it couldn't prevent my going on to fight. So I went to him, and his job was the classification of all the soldiers being brought into that camp. And at the time, there was not a very clear picture of who they would send overseas. So lots of soldiers who got sent overseas had to be sent home. They would be mentally retarded, they would be physically usually in good shape, but or very inadequate to be a soldier, knowing their left hand from the right hand and so forth. So he wanted me to classify soldiers that went by and to prepare them to having to go home. Ironically, I think some didn't want to go home, that the Army was the best place they'd ever been. And learned an awful lot about young adolescents, and some I was there working with them. And probably some of them stayed as long as 3 to 4 months before they could be sent home. And after this period there, because I couldn't be held longer there, the psychologist said, I want to get you located where I think you might find something better, and he got me assigned to the 142nd General Hospital that at that time was located in the Fiji Islands, which now would be the ideal place to go. It's a resort. Then it was a war zone. And when I got to Fiji, I was put in the business office to work. And I found that there was a psychiatrist in the hospital named Whitman Newell, Dr. Whitman Newell from the East, who had been analyzed by Freud and so forth. And Freudian was a big philosophy at that time. And so one day I went in his office and asked, could I volunteer when I'm off duty at the other department? And he said, sit down. Said, can you take a Rorschach, will you take a Rorschach test? Well, I happen to know about the Rorschach, so I started to answer and exaggerated my answers, and about 3 questions he said, you know this. And I said, yes, I know it. And he said, I'm going to ask for you to be assigned to me and take it off your other job. And from then on, we were partners, really, in the clinic for, I think it was, 3 years. And he was a wonderful man, and later wanted me to come to work for him in the East, where he had a clinic. And other psychiatrists joined us, and I essentially worked with the mentally ill there, and it was probably the most difficult job because I was locked in all the time with the crazies. And you're in danger. Some become very, very disturbed and very upset. But I found that if you get to know them, and they get to know you and to trust, that you're pretty safe.
So going into the Army after you had been at the New York School, how did you see your preparation just come to life for you?
After the end, to get back into civilian life?
No, you had gone to the New York School before you were...
Yes, I hadn't brought this in.
So tell us about your preparation at the New York School, your years there, and what they produced as the foundation again to this, this remarkable career.
First, before I got to New York School, Idaho had sent me to Washington, the University of Washington, for a year. And the dean of the new school at the University of Washington was Arlene Johnson, who eventually became dean in USC. So Arlene started the Washington School, and then came to California at the request of USC, had started to change from sociology into social work as such. So I had that experience of change. And that's where I first met Arlene Johnson, of course. And at that time, I was eager to learn as much as I could, and I learned that in Seattle, there was an agency called Ryther Child Center that was unique, that it was one of the first residential treatment centers for mostly disturbed children in America at the time. And I just was curious enough to go over and see it. And so one day I went over and I was told to wait in a waiting room. There were two other young men there. And that Miss Johnson, who was the director, Lillian Johnson, and who had created the program really, would see me, and then I could see the place. So she saw the other two, and then it was my turn. And I went in, and here was this little lady, fiery little creature, sitting at her desk with her shoes off and her feet in the bottom drawer of the desk. And she started asking me very personal questions. And I said, do you ask everybody these kinds of questions just when they come to see your institution? She said, aren't you applying for a job? I said, no. She said, well, you can have it. And I said, what? And she said, you can become one of the boys' supervisors here. And I said, I'm not sure I can. I had to clear with Arlene Johnson, who was not very happy about it, because it meant additional work to my schoolwork. But she finally agreed that I could. And I think I probably learned more about working with children rather than anywhere. And its uniqueness was that it kept a residential center taking care of about 20 children at a time, half boys and half girls. And of the age from about 8 up to about 14 at the time, as I remember. And then had a group of foster homes that became Ryther homes. And these foster homes were then educated by the staff to become foster parents and then constantly supervised. So when a child went to a foster home, they went to another aspect of Ryther. If they did succeed in the foster home, they were brought back into Ryther and stayed. Many of the children could be sent home after being there. But there was a close relationship between the institution and the carer. And these were not just foster homes picked up. They were educated places. Staff could be in any place. And so over the years since then, that program has expanded to be a very large program. Now, I think the last report had over 20-some psychiatric social workers, a psychologist, and a psychiatric consultation with doctors in Seattle. And I have not visited it for numbers of years, and I'm sure it's changed a lot. But as long as Lillian Johnson lived, she keep developing it in unique ways. It's been written up. There's a wonderful article once in Life magazine about Ryther. After that, many places started to want to be residential treatment centers. Many times that's a false title for the place they are.
Yeah, true.
But it was a remarkable experience to have that. And certainly what I learned there helped me later as a teacher.
And And from your experience in Washington, what followed in terms of your education? Did you go to the New York school from Washington?
Yes, I took, I had to go back to Idaho to fulfill a year of work
Okay, sure.
because I had the scholarship.
Sure, sure.
But money is always an issue for
The
students.
promise was the promise that you were pleased to.
At the end of the year, I got a wonderful scholarship from the New York School of Social Work, which was the first school of social work in America. And it was developed by a group of society women in New York who volunteered in various social programs and thought you must be educated for this, and raised the money to start school.
Okay.
And I had just great teachers. Some of the leading social workers were then teaching. So while in the New York school, I was placed in the Psychiatric Institute, New York Psychiatric Hospital, and worked with both children and some adults in this, and learned a lot about life in New York and poverty in the slums, so forth, which was quite a contrast to Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've gone through your major educational experiences and your years during World War II. The part at which your career began and became legendary, I would think, would have been at USC. Is that correct, do you think?
To being
Legendary. And that's my characteristic, that you've had one of the outstanding careers in the profession.
oh,
And I would wonder, or at least the next step that I think you would want to share with people is how what has gone before led you to USC.
well, I really had never intended to teach, and Arlene Johnson contacted me just on my way home from the Army and asked me to come in, and I told her I wanted to practice in an agency or run an agency, and she started to help me look for something in Los Angeles. But she kept saying, why don't you come for a semester until you find what you really want? And she had me placed in Family Service Agency downtown and as a field teacher. And some of my first students started with me as a field teacher. And for 6 months I was with the Family Service, found it quite outdated. And a woman who directed it, very good human being, but rigid on having to control everything. Wanted to read every record and advise every move the worker made. So it was, I think I probably disturbed that, and it got changed eventually. But after that, the faculty voted to have me come on faculty, and that I did, and started to really enjoy teaching. And probably the best experience of any was having years of teaching at USC, later teaching other places simultaneously.
Well, you know, I grew up in this community, and certainly long before I ever went there, had heard of USC School of Social Work. The degree, and in my early years of working, certainly the degree of collaboration, and more than collaboration, leadership, that the school had given to the community of agencies in Los Angeles. Is that anything that you care to comment on?
I don't know that it can. The one thing that had to be done early, even after Arlene had been there 4 years, when I came aboard, the agencies here were almost medieval, some of them. There was a Catholic Children's Agency that really was medieval. Mm-hmm. And there were adoption programs that kept kids 3 and 4 years before they ever found a place to put them. And the philosophy pretty much from the some of the schools that you had to match the child physically. So that you go to the adoption agency, there'd be all these pictures on the wall of the babies and of applying parent, and the staff would see what they looked like. They hadn't learned that children come to look like parents they live with, whether they're their real parents or their adoptive parents, that they had to walk and talk and so forth very much like those parents. But here was lots of money being wasted, awful slow adoptions, and no black children, no Asian children, no Hispanic children in any of the institutions. There was a little institution for Hispanic boys. It was really a little farm in which they earned their living pretty much themselves with gardening. There were large institutions for adolescents, McKinley Home, which would have 20 to 30 kids living in a dormitory together. So forth, really ancient programs going on. And the no child guidance to amount to anything. So our whole faculty at that time started to work to try to change the community, and I got on boards, served in as advisory capacities, and I think changed the picture of the field work, which is terribly important.
And that was the question I was trying to get to, how Dean Johnson with her faculty really seemed, as I understand it, to have taken a leadership which was eventually received by the agencies for a real improvement in the quality of social services in this community.
She did it herself partly. She got on boards. She was very active in the child guidance movement here. And she went to England and learned something of what they were doing in the programs. She got the faculty interested in serving on boards and really being a part of community as well as doing anything else. And then we started to get particularly the children's agencies to belong and tie in with national agencies like the Child Welfare League of America. We got one agency to join, and then we found that the others started to want to join. And little by little you build up agencies that started to meet the standards of the Child Welfare League. And they were very cooperative with us that time.
I think that is a good entree into your having chosen child welfare, particularly in as your career progressed? Certainly it started with your practice at Ryther, but as a social work educator, your career was noted for being a component of the best of child welfare practice, as I understood it.
Well, I hope that was true.
I think it was, in terms of how people requested your input to what they were doing, both within the country and in places outside the borders of the country. How would you describe the best of professional growth in child welfare from your beginning in that field until what you may have thought of as its best point?
It's difficult to say which is best. I think it depends on where you're living. In Los Angeles, the problems of child welfare are so great as they are in many cities that some very poor work's being done now. It has been done for a long time. And it's been difficult to keep good staff, I know, or to get adequate money to run them and so forth. But in some of the smaller communities, there have been some wonderful child welfare programs developed, and particularly programs for the placement of children in foster care and institution care. And some of the institutions through the country have become very good ones and should be recognized. And I think the sad thing is we don't learn enough from each other's institutions. If you go to an annual meeting or something and hear. But when you hear of a program that's creative and good, you can learn about it and start to apply what you get from that program to yours. And some programs have been started not by social workers that are remarkable ones. One out in San Bernardino County, a ranch for delinquent adolescents. One of the most interesting programs I ever saw. It was started by a man who was part American Indian, a tall, strong man, and a loving wife who liked adolescents. And they took over the county ranch up there and had the adolescent delinquents, all of them, build the ranch, built their own water system, built their own barracks, each given a horse to ride, built their own swimming pools. And all the staff were specialists like a plumber, a farmer, and so forth, who could teach those skills to the kids. And the Indian is very defensive of keeping this separate from correctional programs. It's an example, when a child was brought there to live, he met them at the gate of the ranch in a buggy or with a fringe on top and drove them all around the ranch, showing them where their new place to live. And any official law enforcement person was not allowed in the ranch and kept out. And these kids recognized that they were brought into a protected situation in a way. And they went to public schools down in the valley. They lived to do what other boys do at home in many ways. They were active in athletics, competed with schools in that county. And the Indian was always careful to see that they had what other kids had at their age. I remember once months, I went out to study the program and read records after the program had been going for a while. And I read one letter after another, like, I'm getting married, can I come and be married on the ranch? Could I bring my son in to the ranch? Or will you take my brother who's in trouble? And the support of the ranch came from the very kids who were helped there. I have no idea what's happened with that program because it's so much dependent on one man with an idea. And I think some of the best programs come. Lillian Johnston Ryder alone had the idea. Then they had the leadership to bring them along. And here's a future for many students in school today that they too may come through with great ideas.
Yeah, that's a very important part to make. Child welfare aspired to certain standards of practice, and as you say, it wasn't universal. Are there things from your years of practice, and not practice, your years of participation in the field, both as an educator and as a consultant, are there aspects of practice that need to be carried over to what impressions we may get of what child welfare services broadly tend to be in this era? Are there lessons from the past that you would like to have preserved and used now and in the future?
Well, there's one thing I think that agencies need to recognize is that the assignment of duties to the workers need to be appropriate for a given worker or another worker. That the misassignment happens quite often within agencies. And I learned that from the experience in Salmon City, Idaho, my first place, where the politicians had asked that there be these workers in my office. They had assigned the caseworker was an elderly man who had been a British banker who was stone deaf. He was to be the caseworker. The politicians had dictated this in essence. The bookkeeper and so forth was a wonderful man named Rand who came west to cure his tuberculosis, as they used to think this is true. And incidentally, that was a rampant disease in those days. But here was Mr. Rand from a wealthy Eastern family, very cultured, raised in the best of private schools, so forth. And they had him taking care of the business side, and he had no interest in business or particular talent in business. And the first thing I did was to reassign people. And I think child welfare agencies need to see who does best, example, with certain kinds of children. And Children Protective Agency, where we've not talked about, I worked in San Francisco. I was brought in because really more of an advisory person, because they knew I would soon be drafted, so I was only there several months. But the director was a woman who was eager to do the best possible job, and she wanted some advice on what to change in her agency because she said things were not going well. Mm-hmm. And I went in and just within a very short time observed some of the things. Example, I observed that the intake person, not a social worker, but a receptionist in the office, had been hired for several years, that nobody liked her, and she really was rude to people who came in. And my suggestion was to fire her. But Sophie Hardy, who was director, said, she's backed by so many of her friends in San Francisco, it's going to be difficult. And I said, you have to make a choice. Is losing their friends or losing her, what? And the other factor that's true, that she had misassigned cases to students. There was one woman worker who is quite masculine as a person and that, and she was not getting along with a lot of the cases assigned, but she did marvelous work with teenagers who liked her, and so they made her a specialist of seeing teenagers. And she came through very well, even the short time I was at the agency.
Yeah, matching the person to
the reassignments of things.
Well, given the difficulties facing child welfare these days, would you have principles that you would, or proposals that you would, other than this selection, but feel generally, which seems to me more separate from the profession than it was in earlier years? Would you have suggestions for the future?
Well, I'm not sure I do, because I don't know what enough is going on today. I'm not up to date on it. But I know there needs to be change. I read the newspapers.
Yeah.
I read the magazines, and I know change is needed. I wished I could be of help, but I can't.
At this point. Well, are there things that we haven't covered that you would like to be sure to cover?
Well, I think probably one of the most important things is that workers really learn to know themselves. Are they on a job they enjoy? Is it because they are overpressured that they don't enjoy it, or find out why? And wonder whether they should stay at the field if they're not happy there. Because I think unhappy workers don't do good work. And I think if they feel they are happy in the field and find a job when it's possible, and it wouldn't be at this period, in some place that would be suitable for them. That not only that, to learn that the workers need to develop a life outside of their work as well. That you do better if you are in touch with the outside world than if you just always with your social workers, even though the best friends I've had in my life are social workers, many of them. But I've always had others and associates of this kind of thing. But self-understanding is so important in the job. And many social workers have limitations that I didn't have because I never married or don't have children. And I was free to train. And many workers are tied or bound because they need to take care of themselves and their families.
That's very true. Well, the archives had a last question that I think this may have addressed, but I will, include it. Think of people seeing this recording years in the future. What messages would you like to give to social work educators in terms of what they might do to maintain the vitality and the validity of the profession, and to students and social workers who might see this years from now?
One thing is to advertise social work. There's been very little really public interpretation of what social workers do. Even when I was at school at the New York School and at Columbia University, I did some study of what they've done in the movies, and no television at that time, but in the movies or in plays. And there were very limited things that ever about social work. And example, a few years later, a major movie came out with a top movie actor, and I can't recall his name. And the scripts were excellent on cases. Each sequence had a case. And the social workers themselves destroyed the program, got it off the air finally, because they didn't allow dramatic license. That they portrayed it with some things that were not necessarily accurate in social work, but at least people started to want to know social workers because they liked the actor who played the lead, so forth. And but to get other people interested, like the movies. I had one example in consultation. I was asked to do the dialect for a role in a film that was made, a major film by Ida Lupino directed. I was to write a role because the leading man, and it was written to be a social worker.
Oh, okay.
And so I worked with the writer and with Mr. Pino, and we got the script out, and we had a Hayes office at that time, which looked after the malls of America, and they read the script and said, "Oh, this can't be played by a social worker. It must be played by, the role must be a minister, that they're dealing with problems of rape in the picture. And only a minister can carry the role." So they took my social work dialect, made the character in the movie a retired army clergyman. And we had a great chance there to have done a job of interpreting what social worker was, but we lost it.
Well, I think that certainly as well will be well taken advice for social work educators and social workers whose careers are ahead of them. And unless there is more that you would like to say, I wonder if this is a time that I can say what a pleasure and with what pride to share this exchange with you.
Well, I really felt that I've had an interesting and a rewarding life through, not financially, but in experience. And the experience with people who measure up to so many social workers do. I've been a very lucky guy. And it's a long run in life, and it's a very good one, with lots of adventure. And I certainly wish all of those who want to be social workers and are becoming social workers to have happy and successful lives.